Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Condo Solutions Monday mornings, 9 to 10 o'clock. We talk about condo stuff. So we're here for you. We're here to answer your questions about some of the things that go on in condominiums and homeowners associations. We don't always know what's going on behind your neighbor's door, but we know what's going on behind your board's door. So give us a call if you've got a question about some of the things that are happening, some of the questions that you might have about your association, because that's what we're here for. It's a community service program to help you out. And we're here every Monday morning on Condo Solutions. And again, from about 9 to 10 o'clock to answer those questions. So if you've got something going on, maybe you're having some things happening at your association, talk to some of your friends and invite them to join us on the show on Mondays, and we'll be happy to help them out as well. And my name is Mark Breckbill. I'm a local CPA and also a community association manager. And I'm joined every Monday morning by Peter Mullengarden, who's our attorney. And Peter's been with us since the beginning. And as many of you know, he's a great attorney, specializing in this area, and just knows a ton in the area of condos and HOAs. So he's the kind of guy you want to have on a program like this. And he's also the kind of guy you want to have helping your association as you go forward. If you need assistance, he's one to do that. And he's a great guy. And we'll give you that help. Now, some of the ground rules, pretty simple. You call in, you give us a name, not necessarily your name. We don't want your association because that messes things up. And all you do is ask your question. And then we give you the best answer we possibly can. We don't give you a legal answer that you can necessarily go to court with because we don't have your documents. So for that reason, we don't always know what some of the ins and outs are there, and it could change the answer. But it definitely will give you what we call a radio answer, which is the best answer we can possibly give you based on current practices, laws, rules, regulations at the state level, your interpretation of your documents, and the other things that come up that may allow us to not be able to give you a hard and fast answer, but at least what we hope is a really, really good answer. You can call in. Like I said, you're welcome to call. The number is 220-9788. Again, that's 220-WSTU. The area code is 772. So feel free to call. Evan will get you on the line. He'll abuse you a little first, but otherwise he will get you on the line, and he'll get you on the air. And we hope you'll call. One of the things that we always tell you is sometimes we'll talk a little broader than your question because there are people out there that are in other associations. That's why we don't use the association name, that are in other associations that may have a similar problem, but not exactly the same. And so we will talk a little broader to maybe cover their issue if it's not exactly the same as yours. So have some patience if we're talking about a little, something that maybe is not exactly the same as yours. But if it isn't the same, and you can let us know so that we can help you with your answer. Anyway, that's it. That's the basic rules. I just took up half the show to tell it, but that's the basic rules. And we're here for you. So feel free to call, and we'll get you on the air. Morning, Peter. How are you?
Good, Mark. Good morning. How are you?
Good. I'm doing really well. I was, it's been kind of interesting. We got all kinds of things, got all kinds of things going on out in the world today, between all the election stuff and all of the mail-in ballots. And so I thought, it's kind of interesting that in Florida here, we've had experience with mail-in ballots for some period of time. And even though we get criticized, the fact of the matter is, because we have so many condo associations in the state, we do have a procedure that works that we've used in the condo area, and we of course use a similar, it's not the same, but similar concept on the other side of it with the general elections. So I know there's a lot of people that right now they're starting to come back, and right now they're probably just looking at budget stuff. But why don't we talk a little bit about elections? Because I do know some, there are some things going on out there. Some people try to have their, elections before the new year, get a new slate of officers in, especially some of the HOAs. But So we'll talk about that. But one of the things too, Peter, I wanted to go over a little bit is the budget process, and again, to kind of remind people what the requirements are there. Do the members have to vote on the budget? What if the members disagree with the budget? Does the board have to uh, get the people involved on the budget, or can they just do what they want to do? So I thought maybe it might be a good idea to recap some of the things that we talk about relative to budgets.
Okay. Well, generally speaking, for most associations, and so almost all, but I'm sure there's a few that aren't, the board is authorized to adopt the budget, and that's pursuant to the association's governing documents. We're generally speaking, the association through the board of directors adopts the budget each year. Now, for condominium associations, Chapter 718 has a specific procedure with respect to the board meeting at which the budget is adopted. Unlike a typical board meeting where you post a 48-hour notice in advance, for the budget, unless the documents have a longer time period, the association must send the budget with the notice of the meeting at least 14 days in advance of the board meeting at which the budget's going to be adopted or going to be considered for adoption. So that's a special type of board meeting. It's not a typical 48-hour posted notice. It's a 14-day notice, mailed, hand delivered, or electronically transmitted to the owners. Now you have to remember, for electronic transmission, which typically means by email or by fax, for those people still faxing things, the owner has to agree in writing to accept their notice by electronic transmission. Otherwise, the notice must be mailed or hand delivered to all the owners along with the budget. As you've discussed many times on the show, the budget is composed of two parts: the operating part of the budget and the reserve schedule part of the budget. So I think as part of this discussion, Mark, we could probably talk about reserves too, since they are an integral part of the budget. And the issue of full reserves versus partial funding or waiver. I'm not sure whether you want to go into that, but it is, to me, it's an important part of the budget adoption process. Operating side, as that word implies or means, is your day-to-day operating expenses. The reserve side are the deferred repair replacement expenses, sometimes known as capital expenses. I don't really like using that term personally. I'd rather refer to it as the deferred repair replacement, things that you do on greater than an annual basis. And talking about reserves, there's three items that you must budget for in your reserves no matter what they cost, and that's painting, paving, and the roof. And anything else must be in the reserve schedule that costs more than $10,000 to repair or replace on a deferred basis. So that can be a wide range of things, anything from elevators, air conditioning system, concrete, pool deck, the pool itself, in terms of resurfacing, could be pumps, could be irrigation system. It all depends. Again, if it costs more than $10,000 to repair or replace on a deferred basis, then it must be part of your reserve schedule. You can throw other things. I mean, that you're not limited to that, but that's the minimum things that you have to reserve for. Really quick on the homeowner association side, interesting enough, unless your documents provide otherwise, the budget can be adopted at what I would call a more regular board meeting, a board meeting with a 48-hour posted notice, but the notice must state that the budget's going to be considered for adoption. And then after it's adopted, you must provide you must provide the owners with a notice that the budget is available, or send it to them. Either it's available upon request or send out the budget to the owner. The reserves are also completely different in the HOA, and we can talk about that in a few minutes.
Sure. That's I think that's a good summary of the process. And there's a couple things, and as Peter said, that the operating budget itself is not is not too complicated because it's really what's going to anticipated to be spent in the next year. Um, the it's funny because really I think it from an accounting standpoint, a budgeting standpoint, it's almost and it should be almost a zero based budget. In other words, you should start every year and look again at what you anticipate your costs are going to be operationally for that next year, and what kind of things you're going to have to do operationally. Are you going to have a tree trimming? There are some things out there that might add to the budget this year that you didn't have last year, or deduct. And But unfortunately, I think a lot of associations start out with what they paid last year and try to keep it the same, and that's not always, that it's not always the answer. The other thing is that there's a lot of confusion. A lot of people think that the budget has to come to zero, and that you cannot budget a surplus. And frankly, if you don't budget some sort of a surplus in certain areas, like insurance, you aren't going to be able to pay the bill when it comes due. And that's a real problem that we have a lot of times, is that associations will budget to a zero basis, and then what happens is that, timing wise, the insurance bill comes due, and if they don't have a surplus someplace, either from a prior year or whatever, they are going to have to borrow money to pay their insurance. They're going to have to finance their insurance, and people don't understand that. But it is a problem, is that for most businesses, including associations, you have to have some sort of a surplus, or because your cash needs are different than your profit and loss. So you do a monthly budget, and you take your insurance cost and average it over 12 months, for example. And that may be how you want to look at it from an accounting standpoint, from a budgeting standpoint, but you're most likely not paying it over 12 months unless, again, you finance it. You're actually going to pay it in July or in August or whatever month, or hopefully not then, hopefully in November or December, when it's after the hurricane season. But you're going to be paying it then, whether you've got that cash or not. And that's a common problem with larger expenditures on the operating side, is that they've budgeted the money for it, but there's no cash for it. And so, like I say, a real common confusion is that people think because it's a not-for-profit corporation legally, that you can't have a profit. You got to budget a surplus. If you have a profit, you can't have that. And that's actually really not true. The key to running an association, generally from a financial standpoint, is to find a way to produce a surplus on the operating side without having a tax liability, and then building that up as you're funding your reserves. Peter mentioned on the reserve side, you've got these deferred maintenance items. There again, boards have more latitude than they think. So I've had board members say to me, "Oh, I got a reserve study. I don't want to get a reserve study because then I have to fund that." Well, no, you don't. There are always going to be items in a reserve study that don't need to be funded. And you say, well, why do they put it in the reserve study? Because the reserve study, they're kind of looking at everything that needs to be replaced. And as Peter mentioned, you've got threshold levels, $10,000. You're not required to reserve for some things if they're below that level. It also depends upon how you define an item. For example, Peter mentioned pumps. If you've got pool pumps, well, if you've got two pool pumps that cost, let's say, I'm going to use a high number, but let's say $6,000 a piece, that's $12,000. So you'd say, okay, that's above 10. They have a life longer than a year, so I need to reserve for those. Well, not necessarily, because they're two and they're 6,000 a piece. And so, the chances of you having to replace both of them at the same time may be minimal. So you're not necessarily, so those pool pumps individually are less than the threshold level. So you may decide not to reserve for those because you're going to cover them in your operating budget. the year that it comes up that you have to replace one of those pumps, you're just going to make sure you have money in your operating budget to do that. Now, the other thing that comes up from time to time is on the operating side, you can actually have contingency funding, but there's limitations on that on the reserve side. You're not, you've got some restrictions on contingencies. But on the operating side, you can budget a little bit of, you can budget a little extra in certain categories if you want to allow for, for error, or cost overruns or whatever. Because nobody really wants to go back, even though you can amend your budget really easily. Nobody really likes to go back and change their assessments in the middle of the year and go back to the unit owners and say, hey, you owe another $6 this month. So, so a lot of times people like to keep it the same. So for that reason, it does make sense to, leave yourself a little latitude. What if you have a price increase on your landscape maintenance, or what if you have some extra work that has to be done because of a storm or whatever here or there? You may, you may have a little bit of a cushion in there. On the reserve side, you don't have quite as much latitude. Believe it or not, you can't budget for certain types of increases. You can't budget for. I know a lot of people would like to put a contingency into their reserve budget so that they can have some extra there in case 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, they're wrong. But the state has very strict requirements on how you calculate the items within your reserve, and we constantly get into this thing where if you're budgeting for inflation in those items, the state considers that to be a balloon payment, and balloon payments are not allowed. So what I mean by that is that when you fund in the reserve area, the funding has to be level. It can't be set up so that I'm going to do, $100, $100, and then $5,000. I'm gonna do $100 until it actually has to be done, and then I'm gonna cover the rest of it at that time. Well, you're really not allowed to do that. You could waive it, but you're not allowed to actually use that kind of calculation method. So, because that would be budgeting a balloon payment, even if you did that because you thought that there was going to be an increase there. So let's say you're budgeting for your roof and you're 15 years out, and you're putting that money aside. Well, you look at that, you say, well, 15 years from now, if that roof was 100,000 now, it's going to be 110 15 years from now, maybe more, maybe 120. So I'm going to budget for the cost now 100, but I'm going to budget an inflation factor in there. So I'm going to say it's 120, even though it's really 100. Well, technically the state doesn't allow you to do that. They don't allow you to budget that increase in there. So that's why when you do your budget, you really should every year figure out what that item is costing now to replace it. And presumably, as that is going up, you should be increasing your reserve budget to cover it. So this year, when I do the budget, it's 100. So I'm going to budget for 100 over 15 years. Next year, it's 102. So I'm going to budget 102 over 14 years. And then the next year, it's 106. And I'm going to budget 106 over 13 years. So you're actually doing it, but you're doing it by adjusting the cost, the current replacement cost, because that presumably is going up. Now, if it's not going up, then you don't budget for it. So if the roof is 100 this year, it's 100 next year, it's 100 the next year, it's 100 the next year, then you don't budget for it because there hasn't been any inflation. But it's important to know what that number really is. And so a lot of boards just say it's going to be the same as last year, Well, if that is the case, you're under budgeting for the expected inflation, because most likely it's not going to be the same as last year. And particularly many times it'll be the same for 2 or 3 years. And then all of a sudden you'll get a big inflationary increase. And so you got to kind of look at some of those. The other thing that I see people do a lot of times is, instead of having any kind of reserve study, they will go back. They'll go back and look at the last time they had the roof replaced, and they'll say, okay, how much was that? And they'll look at it and say, okay, that seems like a reasonable number. Well, that may not be a reasonable number at all, because if the last time you had your roof replaced, you did it under an insurance policy because of a hurricane, first of all, the cost of that roof was probably 3 times higher than what it would have been at any other time, because, as we all know that have been through hurricanes, all of those costs skyrocket for the period of time afterwards, because everybody's busy, so they all are having to increase their prices, because there's just not enough people to go around, not enough materials to go around, and then we have material shortages and everything else. So if you're using the last roof replacement from 2004, when we had Francis and Jean, then your number's probably way inflated, even 16 years later. but if on the other hand, you're looking at it each year and looking at a non-emergency situation, then that's fine. That brings up one other thing that's a consideration is the timing of the repair. If you know that most likely some of this stuff is going to have obsolete before it wears out, it usually has to be repaired ahead of time. You need to take a look at stuff. You need to take a look at something like that and determine what, first of all, the true life is, and also what the cost might be. If the next time it's going to be repaired, you think it's going to be repaired as a result of a hurricane, and the prices are going to be up 300%, yeah, maybe your insurance is going to cover it. And that's, I've heard people say, well, we don't need to cover that, we got insurance, or we got this, we got that, and or we got repair contracts or whatever. But a lot of times those things have deductibles in them, and so even if you've got those, you've got to account for the deductible. And that's another issue that comes up now that the deductibles are very high. Do you reserve for capital replacement as a result of a storm? And I think that's something that you need to look at, because if there is a storm that takes place, nowadays associations have 2 or 5% 2 or 5% deductibles. You could have a $1 million deductible, so you could have $1 million worth of costs that are not going to be covered, and that's something that you need to take into consideration. There's also a wide range of items that aren't covered and are just outside your policy, like fencing around your tennis court, landscaping, all of those kind of things. Those are going to be above and beyond your deductible. So, if you have $1 million worth of damage and 200,000 of it is landscaping and all of those, you got $800,000 worth of you've got $800,000 of damage there. That's all that's going to apply towards your deductible. So if you've got $1 million deductible, you're going to pay that 800,000. So those are just a couple things that I think that you want to be aware of when you're looking at what should be in the reserves, what the timing is, and what's going to be done. The last thing I mentioned is there's a couple different ways to do a reserve calculation. One's called the straight line method, and one's called the pooling method, or the pool method. And the straight line method is just like it sounds. You go out and you find each individual item. You look and see how much it's going to cost to replace your roof or to replace those pool pumps, and you determine the life of those left, 10 years or 12 years, whatever it is, and you take whatever it's going to cost to replace it, you divide it by the number of years left, and that's your reserve, the calculation. And you do that for every one of your items that need a reserve, the ones that have a life longer than the year, $10,000 or more, roof, paving, painting. So you set those up. That's called a straight line reserve. What some people are doing is they're doing pooled reserves. They're looking at all of those items and they're putting them into a big pool, and then determining when the items are going to need to be replaced, and they're then factoring in a level, a level funding method. Um, that method, I think, is extremely. I know everybody's starting to do it, and it's just becoming very popular, but it is very, very dangerous. It is and does end up with underfunded reserves on a constant basis. Boards play games with them, some on purpose, some not knowing they're playing games with them, and they don't know how to do the calculation, and they don't realize what the restrictions are on the calculation. So they end up with items being underfunded. When you have a pooled reserve and you actually replace an item and it is substantially higher than than what you anticipated, you have to fund that deficit into the pool right away. You can't just bury it in the pool and say, "Oh, sorry." You got to recalculate that, putting that number in there at the correct amount, and then that's got to be funded immediately because you can't have balloon funding. So you've got to get that funded. I see associations never do that. They hardly ever will put that in there. They just bury it and say, "Okay, well, we'll correct it next time," and they in effect try to make up for it over the next 15 or 20 years. And so it's like buying a car and paying too much for it and financing it. Eventually you got to have gap insurance, and they don't have that in the reserve area, so there's no way to make up for it. But that's a method that theoretically, mathematically, it's supposed to work if you do it right. I have found very few people that do it right. One of the reasons is that they don't take it out far enough. You've got to, if you're doing pooled reserves, you have to take the calculation out to the longest item in the reserve. You've got to take it out and recalculate replacements during the period of time all the way out to the longest item in the reserve. So if that's the roof, you've got to carry out and you're going to replace the pool pumps 3 times before you replace the roof. You've got to show the pool pumps in there 3 times. You don't just put them in there once and say, "Okay, I need to pump," so you don't just take all the items, add them up, and divide them out over the longest term. That's not how you do it. You have to, like I say, you have to determine how many times the item is going to have to be replaced during the reserve period, during the pooling period, and you have to show that replacement multiple times. And a lot of associations don't realize that. They just say, "Here's what my costs are. It's going to be over 20 years. We'll go ahead and put it in there." And then last thing I'll mention on that, the other thing that that associations were doing, like I said, some of them on purpose, is that you would they would realize that they didn't include something in their cost estimate for an item. So, say for example, they needed to do some carpet. They were going to do replacement on the balconies, and let's say the balconies had a carpet, and they forgot the carpet was in there. So all of a sudden it's time to do it, and they realize, oh, so they say, well, it included the carpet. That included the carpet. So we just missed, we missed it. So we're going to carpet's in there. So then what happens though is that when they go to calculate the reserve the next year, they say, well, carpet's not, we're going to leave carpet out. And because that's under $10,000, so we're not going to do carpet. Well, now you've got a shortage, and the shortage was never recovered, and so you can't bounce in and out of the reserve or the pool calculation that way by understating or adding items that really weren't included. The state now has got wise to that on the condo side, and if you do that kind of thing, you have to leave it in there and keep funding it. You can't pull it out the next year and say, well, it's under 10, we're not going to include it anymore. You can't do that. And that was very, very prevalent a few years back when the pooling method, when people started to switch over to the pooling method. So, and then the last thing, I guess, on the pooling is if you decide to switch from the straight line method to the pooling method, you do need to talk to your attorney, and you need to make sure, because you can switch over generally. You can switch over from the straight line to the pooling method going forward, and it doesn't require a vote of the members. But if you're going to take the existing straight line reserves and put them into the pool, that's going to require a vote of the members to be able to do that. So you just need to be, you need to be aware of that. There's ways to switch and implement the pooling method, and one of them, like I said, is to just start going forward and then just factor in the straight line reserves that are already out there and figure, okay, I'll use that money first, but come up with a new pool. But a lot of associations would rather just move their existing straight line reserves so they can use some of that cushion, move their straight line reserves in there. And if you do that, it's going to require a member vote to take the money out of those straight line reserves and put it into the pool. But anyway, so that's pretty much the basic stuff. We got a caller, so we'll get back to that. But John, go ahead.
Yeah, straight question. I'm sure it's been asked before. A manager, property manager, decides that he tells me the board told him not to enforce a restriction. Now, I say restriction because it's in the bylaws. We do not have rules and regs in our community. So whatever regulations we have are in our bylaws. If that is true, doesn't that void all other regulations if the wording is shall and not may? I mean, the board really doesn't have a discretion if it doesn't have may in it, correct?
Yes, I mean, shall is hi John. Shall is a mandatory term, and that means that the association is supposed to enforce the restriction. Now, not enforcing a particular restriction doesn't necessarily void out the other restrictions. Okay, so you do have to look. It would have to be a comparable type of violation in order for selective enforcement to apply. That particular restriction or that particular provision, the association is probably going to have a problem enforcing that going forward because they didn't enforce it. They're going to have a selective enforcement issue that may probably have to reinvigorate or resurrect that restriction going forward, and there is a method to do that. But not enforcing one doesn't void out all the others.
Well, usually the non-enforcing one is usually an oversight. Usually, if I'm not mistaken, it's like wasn't intentional. It was just that they didn't bother to do their due diligence and they weren't paying attention. And one regulation got out of control before they realized they needed to take action. When you deliberately say to a property manager, "Don't enforce a regulation," to me that goes beyond that.
Well, no, I mean, again, that's worse in terms of that particular restriction, and you might have a breach of fiduciary duty because they're acting in bad faith, not in good faith, and things like that. But in terms of, I thought your question was in terms of, does it blow out the entire set of bylaws? No. I mean, is that the wrong thing to do, to intentionally not enforce a restriction? Yes, that's wrong. And again, now you're edging into the ground of, they're not exercising business judgment. They're not acting in good faith anymore. And therefore, when you start acting in bad faith or intentionally incorrectly, now you're in the realm of breach of fiduciary duty. It's a whole different thing.
Yeah.
Right.
It's just that when somebody goes to a grievance committee, how are we supposed to penalize them if we told the property manager not to enforce another restriction? I don't know how you can find someone and not take note of the fact that they told the property manager, not an oversight, not the fact that the property manager wasn't driving around. I mean, that's a totally different animal.
No, but again, you still there's still oranges and bananas, or whatever that old phrase is.
Right.
The fact is, if they're intentionally not enforcing, just to use an example, if they're not enforcing the truck restriction, okay, and for whatever reason, hey, that's an old restriction. Everyone drives trucks now. That's stupid. We don't want to enforce the truck restriction, but it's still in your documents, okay? But they are still enforcing the pet restriction, okay? not enforcing the truck restriction, even intentionally, in my view, is not going to mean they can't enforce the pet restriction because they're not comparable. I mean, it might not be correct the way they're not enforcing the truck restriction, but the two are still separate restrictions, no matter whether it's unintentional or intentional.
Right.
Yeah, no, I understand. I don't mean to belabor the point. It's just that we disagree. I mean, there's potatoes and potatoes too.
Well, but I think what Peter's saying, and I agree with that, is that going forward, you're going to have a very hard time enforcing further truck restrictions. But
well,
you
there's
still
the
always
grandfather thing you do, right? You would do the grandfather says, as of this date, you give notice,
Correct.
and you say, hey, we haven't been doing it, but as of January 1st, we're going to start enforcing it. If you have a truck, you're grandfathered in. If you choose to get another vehicle, you can't get anything but a vehicle. You can't get a truck, such as that. Is that correct, Peter?
That's correct. Yes, that's how you resurrect the restriction, right?
Yeah, but again, like Peter was saying, it doesn't affect the fining or penalties on the pet restriction side. As long as you've been imposing the pet restrictions consistently. I know it seems a little bit, unfair that you're selectively choosing which of the bylaws to enforce, but the bottom line is that it really only affects the one that you're not enforcing. And like you guys both pointed out, there's opportunities to resurrect that. It is hard to do it because, you get people in the community and here's what happens. Like the truck restriction is a good one, is that somebody doesn't really realize that you start seeing enough trucks in the community, you think it's okay to have a truck in the community. So somebody who comes and buys into the community says, well, I relied on the fact that there was, that rule wasn't appropriate anymore because obviously it hadn't been enforced. Everybody in the community has a truck. And so
ignorance of the law is no justification.
Well, it can be though. I mean, if you made a judgment based on, because obviously it was in the bylaws, so resurrecting some of these things, is not always as easy as you would want, because again, you've got situations where, people are relying on what's happened in their decisions. And so, it does get difficult on some of these things. We see it in the HOA communities with sheds all the time, or fencing.
Well, our biggest problem, and you got another caller, I don't want to stay on too long, is we have trucks. We don't say pickup trucks. We have trucks. What we do delineate is commercial, but, that's like, if you're going to not even go specific to begin with, it's so hard to define what is a normal pickup residential truck and what is a commercial pickup truck. Now, the obvious would be signs on the side, but if it doesn't have signs on the side, does it have a chest in the back, a tool chest in the bed, such as that? And then, you get into all this arguing over silly stuff. I don't even know why they wrote in trucks instead of not being more specific, but that's where I am. That's the problem we see.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you, and it's it is very difficult, but I again before we go to the next caller, just oh no, we don't have one. Good, we got time now.
But I just answered his question.
Yeah, I think so, but I think as Peter was mentioning, it's one of those kind of things where going forward, you open yourself up to fiduciary responsibilities that, and actions, like I've said before, under 617, one of the reasons that an association should be under 617, chapter 617 of the Florida statutes, is that it provides some protection for mistakes that a volunteer would make that a professional business person wouldn't make. So, under the corporate side, under 605 or, 607 or whatever, the rules there are much less forgiving because they're for-profit businesses. And the understanding is that it's your responsibility to know the law. Just like you were saying, John, it's, ignorance of the law is no excuse. On the for-profit side, that's absolutely true. On the 617 side, it's absolutely not true. I mean, they give you a lot of latitude for, you can't just blatantly ignore it, but they don't expect you as a volunteer board member of a not-for-profit corporation to know all the laws and rules and regulations, because that's not your business. You're doing this as a volunteer. So there's a lot of latitude there. That
So when you write up the docs, you're saying you're a good law firm writing up docs for a community should always include the language of chapter, include it in their docs that it pertains to chapter 617.
well, you should be chartered under 617.
No, you probably
Okay.
created under 617 anyway.
Okay.
Yeah. See, the condo docs, the condo statute 718 and then 720 for the HOAs. That's the governance of condos and
Mhm.
HOAs. But the setup of the corporation itself, the corporate
corporation,
is
not for
617, right? And so now I will tell you, and for some of our listeners out there, you need to check that, because there are, particularly if you're a co-op and you had previously been a mobile home park, you need to check that. I see that all the time missed, is that they were a mobile home park, which was a for-profit entity, and it was chartered under something different. And then all of a sudden, they bought out and became a co-op, and they never changed their original documents. And that's important, because it also may impact what you're paying in other certain types of taxes, including real estate taxes and other things. So anyway, so just so you know, that's really what you're looking at. And as Peter pointed out, if you start blatantly ignoring rules that are legitimate, and that there's not an exception to it, now all of a sudden you're starting to move into that area of beyond just negligence or lack of understanding, and into the gross negligence area that might open yourself up to some liability as a board member. So,
And Mark, can I ask you one more thing if you don't have another caller?
no, go ahead. Yeah.
Last week, when you mentioned that Reese case, I just want to be clear. When the developer turns over to the builder, are we in the 4th District
Yes.
appeals? Is that what you said? Okay,
Mhm.
yeah. So that covers from Palm Beach up to here. The ruling was not like the rest of the state, whereas when a developer turns over to a builder, you got to start counting the lots, and the builder is responsible for each of his lots, even if they're not improved. Is that my understanding? Did I hear that correctly last week?
Yeah. Well, yes. What it boiled down to is if you've declared the units, in your declaration, you've declared those units, then you have to start paying on them. And that's where the other courts came in and said, yes, if you've declared. The 4th District said that even if you've declared them, if you haven't built them, or if you've got language in there that they're not accessible until they're built, then they're not included. And they're not included.
That's what I thought you said.
Yeah. And that's what happened.
Yeah, when you say declare, like a builder of single-family homes, he's got 50 lots, and he declares, he's going to divide it up in 50 lots. That's all he has to declare in any other county or jurisdiction besides the 4th District, and then it's considered accessible, even if it's not improved.
Well, what happens is more like what Peter was talking about with the phasing. So what happens is I've got a housing development that's going to be 300 units, right?
Yeah.
So now I'm going to build the first 50. So in a lot of places, they'll just come in and bring in and get approval for the first 50, so that those units are declared and they become units while they're building those out. So the other 250 are not accessible. They're just they're just vacant land at that point. But what happens?
A good point. Martin County doesn't like that.
Well, what happens is
it really doesn't like that.
Well, they don't mind, but what happens is the developers don't like it, because in Martin County, if I go in and declare those 50, now I come in and do the next 50, and Martin County says, no, we're not approving that. And so
that's what you said.
Yeah. So now you got a 300 unit project that's got all this infrastructure that you can only get approval for 50 units. And and that's what I was getting at. And that's why, the 4th District probably has sided more on the side of the developer up here because of that. Because the developers have acted, to get approval just to protect themselves, so that they knew that they could ultimately build the project out. Whereas in other areas, they didn't have to worry about that as much. Anyway, so that's
Well,
that's
thank you again for your time.
Yep, no
I
problem.
appreciate you. Gentlemen, have a great day. God bless.
You too. Thanks, John. So anyway, I know we're we're getting up here to the final portion of the hour, but I want to mention again just on this concept with the reserves and with and the funding there. You also need to talk to your CPA at this point. The whole concept of when you recognize revenue relative to reserves, and how you're going to fund those, and what the tax effect of that is. All of those things have implications in what you're doing, and the pooling can significantly impact what kind of tax return you're filing, and that can, in the long run, cost you money if you're not careful. So just look at all of that. If you're, pay some attention. Get a reserve study done every 4 or 5 years. It'll cost you a little bit the first time, and then after that, they'll update it for really not a lot of money, because the cost is in the initial infrastructure of the study. So get that done so you know what you're dealing with, and because especially if you're waiving full funding of reserves, because it's one thing to waive full funding if you know what full funding is. But if you haven't done a study and your full funding is half of full funding, and now you're waiving half of that, then you're quarter funding, and that may not be what the members thought they were doing. So anyway, we appreciate you joining us, Peter, as always. Appreciate all your wisdom and continued advice, and I know our listeners do. We're here every Monday from 9 to 10 o'clock, so join us. We'll be happy to get your question on, answer it, and have a little dialogue and discussion. We appreciate the calls. And let your friends know. Give us a call every Monday morning, 9 to 10 o'clock, right here on WSTU Digital 1450, for Martin County's Heritage Station.